Hi there. Let's talk about graphic narratives. In this lecture, we're going to look at the influence of digital technology on the way comics are made and the way they are read. To begin with, let's look at some of the first tools, the personal computer that came in the mid-80s and started to influence the way people created comics. The interaction of words and text was easier. The way you could kind of introduce pre-formatted design elements with fill was something that allowed the work to be made relatively quickly, but to create the illusion of something hand-drawn was still very far away. So these new visual effects, these new tools began to explain. Shatter, written by Peter Gillis and illustrated on the computer by Mike Sains, first appeared in 1985 and is typically considered the first attempt at a full-length graphic novel completely in digital form. But it wasn't long after Shatter that mainstream digital production was introduced into the comics of DC and Marvel. One of the challenges they faced was this equipment was expensive and it was not a time-saving tool to begin with. It took a great deal of time and energy to try and create something that was on par with what artists could do much more easily by hand. And these colorized and manipulated pictures allowed them to do Akira, which we mentioned in our last lecture about, changing the formatting. Translating comics suddenly became much easier. And this is the beginning of a huge explosion in translating comics, which used to be very difficult to achieve. We also had Batman Digital Justice in 1990. And again, these comics were novelty items for these mainstream publishers as they explored these tools and tried to figure out what was possible with them. It still was a very long and time-consuming project. One of the things that had been a huge bottleneck in comic making for a very long time was handwriting the lettering. Now, of course, typeset lettering was always an option, but most people really felt that the typeset lettering that could be used lacked personality and didn't provide for variation that would give a sense of the voice of the character or the hand of the artist. And it wasn't until 1992 when Richard Starkings, who was a master letterer, realized that the time had finally come to explore this new digital technology and develop really fine hand-looking lettered fonts that allowed for the nuances of a master letterer to be made widely available. This allowed for faster editing, faster introduction of the text, and as digital tools were becoming more and more widely available, this really was a pivotal moment in the comic industry as it greatly simplified one of the most time-consuming and difficult aspects of comic making. As the tools became more familiar, Photoshop begins in 1988, and these are widely used tools in the industry of design. We start to see their influence in more nuanced coloring, reflections, rain effects, more subtle lighting that can be introduced and edited in a very nuanced way. And so we see that in the Ultimates you see here by Mark Millar, Brian Hitch, and Andrew Curry in 2002. You can see the way in which these visual effects, very cinematic, sort of black background that is, really makes these rich colors pop. Other experiments in digital technology was the movement between illustration and photographs. We can see that in Mr. Punch, written by Neil Gaiman, and art by the famous illustrator Dave McKean. And here they had a special font they used for hand lettering, and they used photographs for the puppets, and then they actually did illustrations for the people, so that the puppets appear more realistic and the people seem more illusory. Here again, this was Veils by Pat McGreal, where photographs were digitally altered and actors were photographed in various poses and then transposed into realistic settings, period settings in the Middle East. And so there's a sense of this greater realism that was possible while still maintaining the sort of illustrative and graphic qualities that people wanted in comics. The vocabulary of comics was also entering into the digital domain. Microsoft introduced in 1995 Comic Chat, trying to encourage people to engage in chat rooms. They wanted to develop avatars based on cartoon characters that could interact in a comic strip format. And when you wrote the text, it would appear like speech bubbles that your avatar had said. And this was, trying to take this old technology of the comic book and maintain that visual reference in introducing the new technology of the chat room. Well, it wasn't long before people really didn't need all this comic chat infrastructure, and people just wanted to talk, and people wanted a much more simple mechanism. You still today see in your text messages, they often appear in shapes like speech bubbles. The person who really began to explore theoretically what was happening in the comic industry and sort of in a fantastic way begin to sort of think about what was really possible with a digital comic was Scott McCloud. And he wrote a book after his Understanding Comics called Reimagining Comics, where he saw the possibility of this infinite canvas. In a digital world, you're not limited to a piece of paper. You could really create a comic which spread out into every imaginable dimension and provided readers with an immersive and complex reading experience. And so this was the big vision that Scott McCloud introduced, was the way in which we would completely reimagine the way comics were read and the way they were experienced and provide a much more complex idea of reading. He was very skeptical of a lot of the augmented interactive comics that he was seeing. He thought that a lot of the music and the sound and vocal narratives that were transposed onto the comic experience were really diminishing a lot of the reading experience, and that he thought the redundancy of both seeing a speech bubble and then hearing someone read it, or these very limited animations where you would see a tiny bit of movement, all of these kinds of things were not genuinely enhancing the reading experience and were distracting from the essential component of reading comics. And a lot of people explored this. Eagle One Media distributes this different Marvel cross-gen titles. They created these CDs that could be played on Xbox, DVD players, and Mac and PC computers. And they tried to create a whole series of comics that had these various interactive elements in them. And they propped these up with the hope that this was going to be the next big thing in the comic business. Well, if you've never heard of this or you've never seen this, I'm not surprised, because it wasn't long before all these sort of augmented comics died and disappeared. There's still pockets of these kinds of things happening in the comic world, but in a much more limited way. This was not a big production item that major producers were going to explore further. The internet provided a new means of distribution, and with this wide open audience, a lot of self-publishing, zines, and other kinds of small press things quickly moved online. And people began to experiment with different forms of payment. It would take a while before what we now have available to us in things like Patreon or Kickstarter, which are enormously influential in supporting comic artists today. Advertising, pay-per-view, all of these things were being worked out in the early 2000s. Both amateurs and professionals began to move to the internet. We have 1993, Netboy was considered one of the very earliest examples. Kevin and Kel by Bill Holbrook, 1995. These are ways in which professional comic artists and amateur comic artists saw an opportunity to communicate with their readership in a much more intimate way. They had chat rooms and other ways in which people could give feedback about where the comic was going, and then they could interact with the artist. And this is something that's grown considerably in comic making today. One of the big hits in early online comics was Chris Onstad's Eggwood, which first appeared in October 1st, 2001. It's a really extraordinary and ridiculous comic about these sort of stuffed animals that have these sophisticated adult lives. And while it started out very simply and very humbly, it quickly grew into an online sensation. And it provided all kinds of ways in which people could experience the various characters. Each of the characters had their own identity on the internet, and they produced various zines and artworks and things that different, if you had a favorite character, you could kind of follow their life outside their activities in the comic strip itself. And so this proved really popular. And for a while, you could vote on which strips you liked. And, again, they had this chat room, people commenting. But of course, as these comments became intense and emotionally driven, flame wars broke out, and he had to shut the whole thing down. But for a while, it was this really interesting community of people who were all sort of sharing an extraordinary experience with this comic creation. And Onstad went out and he created a number of books that he sold on his website, anthologizing the comics that he produced online. One of the things that's happened, which is different from what Scott McCloud introduced, was not this sort of explosion of comic content going in every possible direction, but actually much more smaller comic experiences that were very cultivated and had a very specific audience in mind. They had an aesthetic, they had 3 panels or 1 panel, and they were trying to give you a laugh that kept you coming back for more. Longer, immersive work was being made, but it was these shorter comics that were the ones that people could sort of fit into their busy lives online. Here's a very popular one, Diesel Sweeties, Richard Stevens III, first published in 2000, and Then in 2007, it actually transitioned into print newspapers. And again, it's this retro graphic style. It's not trying to be realistic. It's very obviously a digitally manufactured comic. And that's part of what made it so appealing, that this sort of simple, crude graphics allowed for a very easy and quick creation. And it really focused on the language and the jokes. It diminished the expectations of the artwork. And I think that in the online content, we do see this new emphasis on language over pictures. This is especially true in dinosaur comics, one of my longtime favorites by Ryan North, who's been a comic writer in comic books for a long time. And in his dinosaur comics, he takes clip art and he establishes this frame organization and this placement and cropping of these various characters that never changes. The only thing that changes in dinosaur comics are the words that he gives to those characters. And so it's a really imaginative idea. There he is constantly reimagining what's possible with this visual information. And it's been going on for decades now, and it's absolutely a joy to read. I highly recommend looking out for Dinosaur Comics by Ryan North. Comic book collecting has moved into the digital world. It's now possible to find and read rare comics from the past. It was enormously helpful to me to be able to read and see actual first edition Superman and Batman, the stuff that had been or was very difficult to find, with the ads and the letters and all the actual pages and how they were laid out. And so digitization of the past history of comics has been a huge boon. And they've been trying to sort of organize and sort through a lot of these collections. Comic Book Lover early on was a way in which you could, assemble all your digital files in the comic book format and made it easy to read, scan, search through, and add notes to your favorite digital comics. Going forward, the major publishers began to introduce online subscription comics where you could buy access to their back catalog and any new titles. This was satisfying to a certain number of people, but never really took on in a big way. It's still possible to buy digital versions of comics. The price point is still fairly high, because the publishers really don't want to decimate the comic book store industry, which was terrified that everyone would move online and read their comics digitally, and there wouldn't be any point to having comic book stores. So this is one of the ways in which reading online and digital comics have found a way to exist without really competing with the physical format. And to be true, some people really still want to read actual physical comic books. But the ease of use of the collections is really very convenient for a lot of people who don't have a lot of space. The most transformative technology in the 21st century, and I think without much debate, would be the iPhone and in maybe a lesser degree, the iPad. And these two technologies provided new opportunities for people to experience comics. The iPad has a great comic reading experience. It has all kinds of software. It allows for a quick turning of the pages, and there have been a number of specialty software that have been used to help augment and give you a little bit more of an immersive experience without trying to add or overload that experience with too much animation or sound effects. Still fairly straightforward comic book reading. You can also have an opportunity to move from panel to panel, and they sort of choreograph your eye movement, and the panels kind of pop up in front of you as they would in a reading. It's different from reading an actual comic, but it does provide for a very interesting, seamless experience. The iPhone's influence has just now starting to be felt. The problem with the iPhone is it isn't really suited for scanning a whole page. It's much too small. And so much of what we've seen so far is these sort of single image memes or videos that have been the main entertainment content that has fueled the direction of popular entertainment. This is changing a little bit. In recent years, Korean webtoons have taken off. Instead of reading from left to right or right to left, you move from top to bottom, and you're sort of scrolling upward. And the panels are designed in such a way, as you see here in this one, webtoon, Solo Leveling, a comic based on Dungeons and Dragons characters. And you see how the placement of the speech bubbles, one above the other, really helps for that sort of scrolling action. So you can quickly scroll through a longer formatted comic. And this has been the new direction of comics and seems to be overtaking other popular digital formats such as manga and American-style comics. We start to see its influence more and more. The concern is manga has really resisted changing into this webtoons format. They know it works in the page format. Their whole business model has been relatively successful. So there's no great desire to try out anything new. But it may come in time when younger audiences come to expect this technology to work this way, and manga will no longer be the juggernaut that it is. As one commenter said, manga could end up as old people's culture. Children these days are scrolling through webtoons on their smartphones. So where does that leave us? Technologies are coming in, and very soon we're going to find ourselves with new kinds of virtual technologies that allow for different kinds of reading. There's no scrolling at all. The pages turn as your eyes move. And this could lead to some really remarkable formats. And maybe we will see things more like Scott McCloud's Infinite Canvas. The future is leading us in areas we can not predict. One thing is for certain, comics are not the mainstay of the digital world. They're one part of a very rich and complicated entertainment, video games. And though the vocabulary of comics is deeply embedded, the shape and form of what they become may change. They will never be as popular or as widespread as they were when paper newspapers ruled the world.